days, I think it was like the second or third day, I think it was the third day we were there. It was Monday. We had the opportunity to go to a Hindu place of worship. We were driving out of the town we were staying in the mountains, zigzagging along. I think Emery got sick that day too. We're like going back and forth, and we were in the back of these cars, like literally in the actual trunks of these small SUVs, like going back and forth, hitting our heads on the windows, getting really sick. And we finally arrived to this spot, which is a like well-revered and well-respected Hindu temple. And so our purpose there is not to worship a temple, but just to simply observe and begin to pray for the people that are there. And so we get out, and there's 14 of us, and we're Americans, and so we just stand out. Even though we were like a relatively diverse group of Americans, we just stood out. Like you could just tell, okay, these people are not from around here. And on top of that, like this was at 8,200 feet where we got out at. So we are not mountain people. Those of us from Iowa or those from the Midwest, we are not mountain people. We are not trained for the wilderness, and so we look up at this Hindu temple, and it looks it's a good ways up there. It's about, and I looked it up, so you want to know, it was 750 feet in elevation. So not this massive elevation gain, but when you start at 8,000 feet and you're walking on flat ground, you don't really notice anything. But the second you start taking some steps up in elevation, you like realize I cannot get enough air in my lungs. Like I'm going to die. I feel like I'm breathing through this tiny little like coffee straws. Like you're breathing one of those, you're like just trying to get anything you can. And I actually I watched as Sam and JJ like tried to sprint up some of these switchbacks. Like, you're insane, because this is going to be horrible. And then one of them paid the price for it. It was great. Never mind, that's a bad joke. But we decided, okay, we're going to walk up to this. We're going to walk up to the top of this Hindu temple. We're going to make this trek. It's about a 1.5 mile trek, and that's what they call hikes there. They call them treks. That's like they're just the kind of jargon they use, or the language they use. And so we go up, and what's funny is as we're going up, we passed by this brand new cable car system that was literally installed like the year prior and began running in the few weeks before we were there. And we turned to I think one of us in our group turned to our host, and we said, hey, are we gonna ride that? Like, we're gonna go up on that? And he's like, nope. We're not. That wouldn't be any fun. We're going to walk. And so we begin to walk, and even the locals are like, one of them, he looked at us and he goes, are you all going to trek to the top? Like, he was like, okay, you guys are about to do this, because I don't think this is what Americans would normally do. And so we make the trek to the top alongside other locals. There was one dad who had a kid, probably like my son's age, like 1.5 to 2 years old. And he had his kid on his shoulders going up 750 feet, like a 1.5 mile trek up this mountain. And they were like, and we were huffing it. I'm like, I don't know how he's doing this, because he's got a kid on his shoulders. I do it for 5 minutes, my back hurts. And so, okay, he's doing this. Like, these people, they really want to get to the top. Like, they really want to work hard to get up there. And so we eventually make our way to the top. And this was our first kind of experience like this, of being in this kind of worship setting that isn't Christian and is very, very different from our paradigm. And so you get up there and you take off your shoes, and it's not really a form of worship, just more a matter of respect for what their customs were. Take off our shoes, and you get into this big open mountaintop, like this big flat place on the mountaintop. We didn't go into the buildings, but we were out there like just observing. And we see there's hundreds and hundreds of people, like all over the place, of any age, of any like demographic you could think of that exists locally in that region. They're all there. And there were the dads that had like dragged their kids up on their backs to the top of the mountain. And they're there worshiping with incense, right? There's these idols that we had taken pictures of, and there's literally like incense. If you know what a sarcophagus is, I'm pretty sure that's what this is. But it's like one of those things that you put incense in, and it sprays, and it's like just all of these religious things that I just have not really seen, especially in that context. And so it's just this bizarre thing we're seeing, and they're praying, and they're going around, they're offering sacrifices, and there's specifically like these coconuts they would cut up, and they would burn at the altar of these foreign gods. And they were doing all of these things. And I realized as I was standing there watching them worship in the way that they were worshiping, and after we had hiked, it took us almost an hour to get to the top. I mean, because we were a wide spectrum of fitness levels, and it was just really hard because it was at 9,000 feet by the time we got to the top. And I realized I have never, not one time in my life, ever climbed a mountain to go to church, right? I have never, not one time in my life, sweated this much and breathed this hard to get to a place of worship. This is not a part of my paradigm. And here these people are, and they're there, and they're doing it, and they're going off and buying coconuts, and they're sacrificing these coconuts in the form of a burnt offering to their gods. And as I was taking all this in, that day kind of set this trend as I was observing more and more what these people, like what these amazing people, these people who I actually like really grew to appreciate and love, what they were doing to worship their gods. And what was so crazy about it is how laborious it was. They would hike mountains to go worship. They would do ritual after ritual and ceremony after ceremony to please their gods, all in an attempt to get their anger of their gods off their back for a few seconds. There would be there were stories, we were hearing these stories of families who did not have enough food to eat, but would sacrifice their food to eat to these gods so their gods would not be angry at them, so they could have some sort of benefit from worshiping these gods. And it was crazy. As they did these ceremonies, they'd walk around with these bracelets and necklaces on their ankles and on their wrists and on their necks. And they were one person was talking to us, they said he was wearing over 30 at one time. Just like literally physically bearing the marks, like hauling stuff around day by day as a sign of worship to these gods and sign of religious piety. And then things even would get darker. We were talking to a guy, he was just pretty close to my age, a little bit younger. And he was born, according to in this culture, they're really into astrology. He was born on the darkest day of the darkest month and the darkest time of the year. Like, he was kind of what they considered a cursed child. And so they had to do all of these things to try to break the curses, because his family did love him. They actually cared about him, but they wanted to break these curses. And so they did really dark things. He was saying how they do these ceremonies, and there was a time where he was drinking goat's blood. Like, drinking blood of another animal, like swallowing it whole down his mouth. Another time, and this was the darkest one, he was eating rice. He had to eat rice as a part of this ceremony. And normally rice, if you're an American, you put a little water in it, and you put it in the microwave for like 5 minutes, it comes out, it's nice and like soft and fresh. Well, instead of soaking in water, they would soak it in the urine of cows, and actually his own urine. And then he was forced to eat it as a symbol of his religious piety and his worship. I mean, messed up stuff. All in the name of trying to please their God. All in the name of trying to get the anger of their gods off their back. And again, as I saw this build, we went eventually we talked about this weeks ago, to this really religious city along the river. And we saw as people would travel across the country to pilgrimage there. We saw as people would worship this physical river and this physical place. And how much work it all was. Man, they really had to work hard. And as I was going through this and watching it all, I kept every day by day, as it would grow. And even like there were Tibetan Buddhists there. And we walked into one of their temples, or the outside of one of their temples, and they had these prayer wheels. And on the outside of the prayer wheel, they had this like little plaque, and it talked about how the more you pray, the more spiritual unlocks, as one of our local hosts would describe to us, more spiritual unlocks you would have. Like if you're playing like Call of Duty and you unlock certain weapons, like you become more spiritual the more you pray. And so they had these prayers on these wheels, and they designed it so you could spin the wheel, and every time it would go around, it was like a prayer. So you could crank up your prayers faster and faster. And some of the benefits were if you prayed more and you were more accepted by I don't really know Buddhism super well, by the universe, and you could potentially, a benefit of a woman is that you could potentially be reincarnated as a man, right? Like bizarre stuff, and again, laborious stuff. I mean, crazy. And all of that kept building and building, and I realized, wow, this stands in stark contrast to the God that I worship. Like, this stands and like, it is completely and entirely different than the one that I choose to worship, the God that I choose to place my faith in. And so for the next few moments, I want to describe the difference between what we saw and how we watched as people labored and worked to please their gods in comparison to the life of Jesus and the work of Jesus, because it's completely different. And I know many of you might have heard of this before, but I think it's important for us to go through step by step what Jesus did so we understand the context well. So if we consider Jesus for a second, who is he? John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, right? Like, when we find out later that this Word, and I'm going to just fly through scriptures here, so bear with me. But we find out this Word was actually Jesus. Jesus is God. And he was there at the beginning. In Colossians 1, it says, it was through Jesus that all things were made, and for whom all things were made. So Jesus, being God, being there in the beginning, all creation was created through him. All creation was actually created for him and for his pleasure. So Jesus, being with God, being like God, being in heaven with God, he decided to do something crazy. As in the words of one of my favorite preachers, just absolutely bananas. Right? He decided to not consider equality with God, as Philippians 2 says, or not consider being with God or being like God in heaven. He decided that wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth being held on to. And so he let go of it, and he descended into earth. He decided, this place of perfection, it's not worth holding on to. There's something down there I need to do. And so he didn't hold on to it. He actually gave it up. And he descended into this earth that you and I live in. This dark, broken, sinful, evil world he descended into. And he decided that perfection with God wasn't what he needed to be. He needed to be with us. And so the medium through which, right, the way that he got to this earth was he chose to be born of a woman. Right, Mary, mother of God, a teenage girl. And you know what's crazy? I was thinking about this. Jesus, you know what he did? He was in the womb for 9 months. Isn't that crazy? He was a preborn child, like hanging out in the tummy of a teenage Israeli girl 2,000 years ago. He was there for 9 months. The one through whom and for whom all creation was made. The one who was there at the beginning and actually created everything that we see and we know. He decided to be placed inside the body, the womb of a young girl, and there of a young woman. And there he grew, and he eventually was birthed into this world in a place that was not meant for kings. He was birthed in a backwater town called Bethlehem, in a place that wasn't even habitable for people. He was born in a pen for animals. And there, as the blood of his mother mixed with the dirt on the floor of what we think is a cave, he was birthed out and placed into a manger in a feeding trough. There, the Son of God, the one through whom and for whom all things are created, lay. And then he decided to live life like us. Jesus chose to stay here for over 30 years. And so he lived life like us. He was a baby. He was helpless. He needed to be nursed. He needed to be changed. He needed to be fed. He needed to be taken care of. He could not be taken care of on his own. He humbled himself to become a child, to a baby. And they've got crazy cone heads. They're not cute when they're born, right? Like he humbled himself that low. And then he lived life like a child. He had siblings. He had brothers. I'm sure there was some crazy stuff that happened in his home, and him being perfect, right, never sinning. I'm sure his brothers hated him for it. And he had a mom and a dad, and he did the religious things that the religious people of that era would do. And he would pilgrimage to Jerusalem every single year, and he would come back. And actually, people assume that he became what his father was, a carpenter. He learned a trade. He went to school like you and I. And he became a professional in his trade. He became a carpenter for 30 years. And for day in and day out, he labored. He lived life like us. And then he chose to be willing to suffer like us. In that daily life, there was a form of suffering that he took on. Actually, a lot of people think that his adopted father, Joseph, right, because God is the father of Jesus, right? So his adopted father, Joseph, died when he was young. And so there he was, the man of his household at a young age, understanding loss, understanding grief, understanding things being taken from him and being separated in a way that isn't what it's meant to be from the beginning. And so there he understood what it was like to suffer. And then, as he chose to go on in this earthly life, he then was tempted in every way, just like you and I were. The lust that we are tempted with, the things that we want to do, the greed that allures us, all those things tempted Jesus. He submitted himself to it. And then, something even crazier happened. It says that this only happened to, I think, 2 people in Scripture. Maybe it's more, but the only one of 2. Where the devil himself came and tempted Jesus. Okay, again, context. The Son of God, the one who through him and for whom all things are created, came to be born of a woman, lived life like us, was tempted every way, and actually was willing to submit himself to be tempted by the devil. Right? The only person I know that did this didn't do it well, and her name was Eve. Okay, and he underwent everything we have gone through so he could have compassion on us. And then he decided to descend even lower, and he decided, I'm willing to suffer. I'm actually willing to be rejected. Jesus was rejected by men. It says that he was a man of sorrows, well acquainted with grief in Isaiah 53. The people of Israel, his own countrymen and countrywomen, his kinfolk, denied him as their king. Romans 11 talks all about how they were cut off because they didn't receive him as their king. And he was mocked. There was a day where, after the pronouncement of his ministry, as he began to unveil to the world of who he was, that he was the Son of God, that he was there to be the Messiah, the Christ, he went to his hometown, Nazareth, where he was raised, where he was a carpenter, and he opened a scroll inside of the synagogue, and it was the book of Isaiah, and in it he read something, and he said, the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, and I'm here to announce, proclaim good news for the poor, proclaim liberty for the captives, that the blind can see, all these amazing things. And he read it, and then he said, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your midst. Crazy stuff. And you know what the people did, right? To the one who's standing for whom and through whom all things are created, the one who's actually fulfilling prophecy right in front of them, they scoffed at him. They said, isn't this just the carpenter's son? Like, this isn't just Joseph's son. And then he decided to do more work. He decided, I'm going to be the mediator between man and God. I'm actually going to reestablish relationship that was originally separated. And I'm going to become the one that is the go-between between God and man. And so I'm going to set up this covenant or this relational structure through which we can have experiences and knowledge of God. And I'm going to do this, and I'm going to set up the terms. And then I'm going to let my own blood be what confirms this covenant. Because covenants are confirmed by blood in the ancient Near East culture. And he goes, yeah, that confirmation process, I'm going to let my own blood be what confirms that. And so Jesus undergoes the process. And he chooses, and again, I'm going through what you already know. But we have to get this in perspective. Jesus goes on to let his blood confirm the process by serving as a sacrifice. He was handed over to people after he was betrayed by his best friend. Again, he was well acquainted with grief. After he was handed over by one of his dear friends, he was handed over to people that had nothing against him. Completely innocent. People that were just out to get him. And they were so out to get him that when they placed him on trial in front of the religious people of the day, they had to lie to get a testimony to condemn him. And even the liars couldn't even get their story straight. And then after that, the religious leaders brought him to the Roman government. And the Roman government was like, I think this guy is innocent. I don't want to kill him. And still the people are like, no. We want you to deal with him. We want you to deal with him. And so the Roman government's like, well, how about we'll give you a choice. We're going to release either Jesus or this trouble, this rabble-rouser, this murderer named Barabbas. Which do you want? No. And them thinking they're just going to pick Jesus because he doesn't do anything. He just kind of hangs out and heals people. And there the crowds, his own countrymen, his own countrywomen, the people actually just prior were actually giving him like affection and honor. They chanted, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. And from that place, he descended to being beaten, whipped, pierced, crucified, and ultimately dying on a cross. Jesus says in Matthew 20:28, for even the Son of Man, referring to himself, came not to be served, but to serve others and give his life as a ransom for many. And so Jesus dies a death on the cross that's brutal to serve as a sacrifice. Again, reminder, this is the one through whom and for whom all things are created, who was with God in the beginning. He descended to this place of physical death, dying a criminal's death on the cross. And yet still, there was more work to be done. And so he did what no one could do. He took on God's judgment for sin. Isaiah 53 talks about, he uses this language, it says he was counted among the rebels. He took on the sins of the rebels and was counted among them. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, he, being Jesus, who never sinned, decided to become sin or take on the sins of humanity, all of our mistakes and all of our failures. He decided to take it on so that we could become right with God. We could become the righteousness of God is what it says. And then Jesus became the curse. In Galatians 3, it talks about Jesus became the curse. There was a curse that hung over all of humanity because of the things that we've done. This curse of death. And Jesus chose to take that on. And then there's this cup of suffering, this cup of God's wrath. And I know I'm getting into like more religious language, but this is what it says in Isaiah 51, that there was this cup of God's wrath, and we were going to be the ones to drink it. It was, actions have consequences. I'm teaching this to my son. The action was our sin. The consequence was this cup of wrath that we were about to drink. And it's actually crazy. There's a story that reflects this in Hinduism. And their god can't even swallow the cup of wrath. A snake has to come and choke himself off because he's going to swallow it and die. Where Jesus actually takes the cup and drinks it all the way down. And he does die. And he allows himself to go under the punishment of everything that we deserved. And then right before he dies, there's this amazing window that we get. And this is where we're going to land and spend a little bit of more time. Right before he dies, he says this. And you can put this on the screen. John 19:28 through 30. It says this. Jesus knew that his mission was now finished. And to fulfill scripture, he said, I'm thirsty. A jar of sour wine was sitting there. And so they soaked a sponge in it. He put it on a hyssop branch and he held it to his lips. So before, anything that was possible before his death, all of these Old Testament prophecies, these things that have been told about Jesus years ago that he had to fulfill. He's literally fulfilling the last one, right? It says he actually would drink it. There's a prophecy about him drinking a sour wine. So he's doing it on the cross. And then once he finally does it, he says, when Jesus tasted it, he said, it is finished. Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. And the old King James Version says, and he gave up the ghost. It is finished. So the one through whom and for whom all things were created went through all of that work, got to the end of his life and said, it's now done. It's now finished. And so what are the consequences of this finishing, of this completion? The curse has now been taken care of. The burden that sin has on us, our slavery, our inability to get out of it, has now been lifted. The power of sin and death now has been broken. The wrath of God, right? God's judgment, God's holy, righteous judgment has now been satisfied. The justice of God has now been served. This new relationship with God has now been put into effect. Our relationship with God has now been made right. We are reconciled. Our God's approval of us now has been settled. God's judgment of us, his statement of us is now acquitted or innocent. And the work of Jesus, everything he set out to do, is now finished. It's completed. And so as I considered all of what I had known after spending my life following Jesus and understanding who he is and what I believe to be true about him, and as I was understanding that and looking at all these people laboring in Southern Asia, pouring their hearts and their souls and their lives and literally risking their lives in a way that's unhealthy, in a way that I know the Lord would never ask us to do by literally giving the food that we're going to die if we don't eat this, or going into debt, or drinking goat's blood, all these crazy things. As I watched them do that, I go, wow. The contrast is that Jesus says the work is done. The contrast is that my God says it's now finished. And so what's left for us is here we go, someone found their phone. What's left for us is rest. What's left for us is rest. Not rest because we're burnt out, because we've been going really hard in school. Not rest because we've been working our tail off and we haven't been sleeping enough. Not rest because we're about to collapse into exhaustion. Rest because there's no work left to be done. It's been already completed by another. Again, this stands in stark contrast to what the people of Southern Asia do and what we even do here. We have different gods. They go by different names, right? Entertainment, sexuality, success. And what do we do to serve them? We labor, and we work hard, and we work hard, and we work hard, and we can never appease them. But Jesus says, the work is now done. Hebrews 4, 6 through 11 gives us this picture of what we now step into. And there's some religious Old Testament language there that we'll talk through so we all understand this. But it says this, about this rest that we now experience because of the finished work of Jesus. It says, so God's rest is there for people to enter. But those who first heard this good news failed to enter it because they disobeyed God. This is referring to the Israelites. They were offered rest, but they couldn't uphold their end of the bargain. They failed over and over again. So God set another time for entering his rest. And that time is today. Holy cow, that's good news. God announced this through David much later in the words already quoted. Today when you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Now if Joshua, who was one of the leaders in Israel, had succeeded in giving them rest, them being Israel, God would not have spoken about another day of rest to come. So there is a special rest still waiting for those, or for the people of God. For all who have entered into God's rest have rested from their labors, just as God did after creating the world. He's saying, hey, there was a time where I was trying to get humanity to come enjoy my rest. This rest that he actually talks about in the book of Genesis, where he goes through all this work, God goes all this work of creating the world. At the end of it, he goes, oh, it's good. And then he rests in a completed work of creation. That same kind of rest, he goes, I wanted this for humanity. They couldn't do it. And so I set another time for this to happen. And that day is today. And that's happening through Jesus. There is a special rest for those of us who've decided to follow Jesus. For those of us who've committed our lives to him. Who did what John 3:16 said, believed in him. So we can inherit eternal life. There's a special rest that we now get to step into. And it's amazing. It's a gift. And even as I talk about this work rest analogy, this is what Scripture is putting to words, is a reality in our hearts. There's probably things that we're thinking about that we've worked really hard on. Things that we've stressed about, what we've been anxious about, where we've we've held so tightly to, we will not let it go. We know, man, this can't be good for my soul. And Jesus says, hey, there's a special rest here for you today. The work has now been finished. God's approval of us has been settled. The need to lay down more has already been taken care of. The curse, the slavery, the thing that you've been burdened under and laboring under for all of humanity's history, I've now lifted it off, and now there's rest for you. Just like when the nation of Israel left Egypt and went towards the promised land, there was this rest that was offered them, away from their oppressor, away from the people that were holding those things over them. And there's a rest. But then there's this warning, and this is where I want us to take this into account and for our own lives here. There's this warning in Hebrews 4, verse 11. This is right after where I just ended. And it seems like a paradox, but we'll talk through it, and we'll take this warning to heart. In Hebrews 4:11, the author says this, so let us do our best to enter that rest. But if we disobey God, as the people of Israel did, we will fall. Okay, you're like, I thought you just talked about there's this rest, this work is done, it's finished. How can I do my best? And isn't that what people say when you should just work harder and harder to do your best? So if you look at what this whole thing hinges on, and it's referring to the nation of Israel, right? They did not enter God's rest. They failed to enter it because of their disobedience. This disobedience, if you look in the Strong's Concordance, right, this definition of words that were used in the Greek New Testament when it was written, that word disobedience is all hinged around disobedience that comes from unbelief. Comes from unbelief. So we fail to enter God's rest through our unbelief, or believing that God's word isn't as good as it says it is. That his promises isn't as good as it says it is. That his work really isn't finished. We fail to enter his promise when we act out of disobedience because we don't believe God. And man, if you look at, if I look at my own life, I've seen how my actions have driven me. My actions actually are driven by underlying beliefs or unbeliefs. It's actually a very sobering measure. I talked about this last semester. It's a very sobering measure to look at our actions because that's what drives, that our beliefs are driven by those things. We can see what we believe by the way that we act. And so there's two ways that I think that this plays out in our life, this unbelief that will cause us to not enter God's rest, to not experience everything that Jesus worked so hard to give us. The first is this: we don't enter God's rest because we don't believe his ways are better, and so we just continue living our life. We don't believe, okay, God, you let me free from this slavery of sin. You set me free from this way of living that I don't have to be bound to anymore, but I really don't believe that I'm actually stepping into freedom, and so I'm just going to continue on doing what I'm doing. These things that I go to for my pleasure and my satisfaction, they still satisfy me, so I'm just going to keep going there. These things that I find purpose in and I find hope in, I know you say that you're the greatest hope, you're the hope of humanity, I'm still going to go to those places. And so we don't believe that we've really been set free. We don't believe that Jesus' work is really complete. Through our lifestyle, because we ignore the work that he did on the cross, we fail to enter his rest. I've used this analogy before, and I like to think of it this way. Is that imagine we give our lives to Jesus, and there's this new person that happens, right? There's this new birth we've talked about many times. There's a new man, right? There's this new woman that comes. And so we experience this new life, and we look down on the ground. Again, this is an analogy. We look down on the ground. This would not happen. You look down on the ground, and we see our old, dead, lifeless body, right? The one that was buried with Christ, right? The one that went under the water at baptism. We look down on the ground, we see our body. And this failure, this unbelief to believe that God is doing what he's doing, or is doing what he says he's doing, and that he's really as good as he says he is like us bending down, taking out, for me, I'm 175 pounds, taking that 175 pounds body, throwing it up on my shoulder, and just walking around with it. Man, that would get hard. Man, that would be laborious. There's a rest. I can just dump that body on the ground. It's not alive any longer. I'm no longer that person. But yet I still just haul this corpse around day after day, living under its weight, living under its burden of this old life. And I'll fail to enter God's rest. I've done this, guys. I've lived it. I've not entered God's rest in the way that he wanted me to because I've held on to the corpse of my old life for far too long. Let us not fail to enter God's rest. I'm going to invite the worship team up. We're going to end with the second way that we can fail to enter God's rest. Right? The first way we can fail to enter God's rest is not believing what he said, like our belief coming out by continuing to live in what we were already living, right? Not believing that his ways are really better. The second way that we can fail to enter God's rest is not trusting and not believing that God's work really is finished in our life and there's nothing more to add to it. And this comes out for those of us who maybe have been in following Jesus for a while, been in church circles for longer. This comes out in religious games and religious performances. We think, oh God, yeah, thank you for doing the work on the cross, but I know I have more to add. I know I can help you out on that cross. We do this when I think of this as Jesus is running, and I talked to Nina ahead of time, so I'm gonna use Nina as an example, right? Nina's mom runs ultra marathons, and she's right behind me. Nina's right behind me, and her mom runs 50 miles at a time. And so imagine Jesus is running an ultra marathon, 50 miles on our behalf. And he's running 49.9 miles. And he gets to that last 10th of a mile, and we jump out in front of him and say, hey, Jesus, wait. I got it from here. I'll finish it. I can do it. I'll get us across that finish line. Not recognizing that he is meant to do all of the work. He's going to, and is the only one who can get us across that finish line. We can't even take one step on our own. Nonetheless, 50 miles. And so we think we can somehow add to the work of Jesus? We think we can somehow add to the finished work of Jesus on the cross by coming to Chi Alpha more often, and that's going to change God's approval of us? We think, man, if I can just talk more religiously and sound more spiritual in my prayers, God's going to listen to me more? We think we can add to God's finished work by getting our leadership title and making people think that we're really religious, and that by us doing more good deeds, that's actually going to let God look past our sins, that it's increasing our chances of getting into heaven? We like to think we can add to God's work. But here Jesus says, and he's on the cross, after he did all of those things that we spent a lot of time walking through. All of those things is the one who through him and for him all things were created. He did all of those things as the one who descended so low that he drank the cup of wrath that no one could. He did so much work, and he sits on the cross and he says, it is finished. And now there's a rest for us. There's a rest for you. There really is. And I'm not saying this because I'm trying to create an emotional moment. Guys, I've been through this so many times. This comes from a place of working through this for over 10 years. There's a rest for you and I. Let us continue on the straight path, not falling to the ditch of not believing that God's ways are better, not falling to the ditch thinking that we can somehow add to God's finished work, but staying on this place of rest that Jesus paid a high price for. Man, he loved you so much that he did all of those things we talked about for you and I so that we can experience rest, so we can be done with our religious labors. It says in Galatians that if we continue to try to live up to the standard of law, Christ died for nothing. Man, Jesus did a lot of work. And tonight, my challenge and my call for us that live in 2023 in Ames, Iowa, on April 12th in this smelly BO stench room because we're all sweating, is that there is a rest for our souls in Jesus alone. And we don't want to fall into the ditch of never living the way that he asked us to live because we don't believe that he's that good, and we don't want to fall into the ditch of being over religious and playing those religious games and those tactics, but simply just being who he has created us to be as sons and daughters and resting in that. It's actually that simple. It's actually that easy because guess what? Jesus did all the work. So you and I didn't have to. Jesus says, come to me all you are weary and heavy laden, for I will give you what? Rest. So let's pray.
Thank you for joining Chi Alpha at Iowa State University this week, where we seek to encounter God and grow with each other. For more information about who we are, follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Chi Alpha ISU.